Let me talk a little bit about the campaign for and against ratification in the press and the publication of what we would today call op-ed pieces. As I'm sure you know, they were principally written under pseudonyms, where today newspapers would never publish a letter to the editor written under a pseudonym. Why the use of pseudonyms is, I guess, question number one, and number two is, does it trouble you at all?
Pseudonyms were used because they believed that their ideas should speak for themselves and that the name should not be associated because the ideas are what is important.
Another key reason that pseudonyms were also used, besides what Lynn mentioned, was as well that these names held great importance to what they were saying. If you look to some of the anti-federalist names of Cato and Sentinel, they were some of the last Republicans when Caesar took over who resisted tyranny and were trying to fight to save the Republic. While at the same time, the name Publius, used by the Federalists, translates from Latin into the people's man, advocating for the people, giving a strong sense that each side had their own claim to history, and they knew what they were trying to fight for, something that needed to be fought for.
And to answer the second part of your question, I think, to me, the use of pseudonyms is a little bit troubling. I think that today, with the internet, people can easily post whatever they want under a pseudonym and kind of have this anonymous post that could be potentially degrading or offensive, and I don't think that that's a good thing. But on the other hand, this was not really what was going on at the time of the convention, so I don't think it was a problem then.
And I would have to disagree with Adrian. I think Lynn made a good point in saying that pseudonyms are to emphasize the idea, it's about the ideas and not about the person who are writing them. I think also it also protects the writer a little bit. For example, Sentinel was actually a man from Pennsylvania. He was an anti-federalist, and Pennsylvania had a very strong Federalist majority, and so I think the pseudonym probably could have helped him, and in that he didn't have to put his name out and he wouldn't be under fear of Federalist attacks from the majority of Federalists in there. He could get his ideas out freely.
Why were some of the small states like Delaware so eager to have the ratification convention approve the proposed constitution?
Well, Delaware, which has the first state on its license plate because it was the first state to ratify the Constitution, was eager to ratify the Constitution because of the great gains it had for the small states. They had won the equal representation in Article 1, Section 3 of the Senate, which was a huge gain for them, and also how that representation translated to their in Article 2, Section 1 in the Electoral College, how they'd have an advantage there as well.
Another reason, if you look to not necessarily a small state, but a not very populated state of Georgia, the convention was actually held inside another capital, which was currently under siege by Creek Indians and had a palisade wall around it. And I was debating there, and I saw in Article 4, Section 4, that the federal government has a duty to protect its state and send military support. I feel very strongly urged to vote for approval.
And what I found interesting about Delaware was that there's 13 delegates at their state conventions, and all 13 of them were Federalists. There were no anti-Federalists that were elected into the state conventions, and so I think that just proves that there's so many Federalists in Delaware eager to ratify this Constitution.
What about slavery? What role does slavery play in the ratification debate?
Well, slavery was really kind of an issue that many did not feel they wanted to bring up just because it was a very touchy issue. Many of the framers owned slaves themselves, so they didn't really want to bring it up just because they were concerned that it would affect the way that the Constitution was ratified. So the Constitution never actually mentions the word slave. It only says other persons, which, you know, I mean, I think it's very, looking at that today, I think all of us are very disappointed.
However, there are provisions of the Constitution that do indirectly, without mentioning the word slaves, address the issue of slavery. For example, in Article 1, Section 2, there's the 3/5 clause, so every 3 out of 5 slaves would be counted, every slave would be counted as 3/5 of the person. In Article 4, Section 2, there's the fugitive slave clause, so states have to, if they find runaway slaves, they have to return it to the owner.
And what I found interesting was that Thomas Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was being an ambassador in France, and he wrote the magnificent words that all men are created equal in the Declaration, and without his absence, it really helped the framers to avoid the topic of slavery.
We've had 27 amendments proposed by Congress, and that have been ratified. What process was used for the ratification of these amendments, and how was it similar or did it differ from what was used for the Constitution?
Well, when you look at the amendments, 26 of them were ratified through ratification of 3/4 of state legislatures, but one amendment was through state conventions. This was the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition, because what the issue that had come to hand was that many, in more rural areas, more rural states, that temperance movement holds had huge death grip on state legislatures, and they couldn't get it passed, thus by meaning that people who wanted their alcohol had to make through a more creative way of the people.
Well, and I also think that looking specifically at the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments passed only 2 years after the ratification of the Constitution, the idea of a Bill of Rights was first addressed in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. It was kind of a little side deal to placate the anti-federalists who felt that a Bill of Rights was absolutely necessary in the Constitution. However, the Bill of Rights was not added at the end of the ratification. What had to happen was James Madison made a promise in his campaign for the House of Representatives to that he was going to add a Bill of Rights, and so he did this when he entered into the first House of Representatives, and eventually his 10 out of his 12 amendments got ratified in 1791.
What role did George Washington play in the ratification process?
Well, one of the key things that James Madison viewed beforehand, when he had tried to organize a constitutional convention beforehand, was that none of the states really took it seriously. In fact, the one that he showed up to just mere months before the Philadelphia one completely failed. No one showed up to it. Governor George Washington didn't play a serious role, but what the serious thing that he added, though, this American hero that led the Americans to independence, he gave significance and made it seem like it was actually something happening in 1787.
In the ratification conventions, though, I believe that people probably looked at the very empowered executive and were less fearful of this extremely powerful... May I finish my thought, please?
Please.
They were less fearful of this incredibly powerful executive because they assumed that George Washington would be elected as the first president of the United States.
Thank you.